removed any reference to God in your declaration. Why is that?
It's a preamble, Liz, not an autobiography.
If I could read some of it to you. The future is our frontier.
Oh, who wrote that crap?
You did.
This declaration is pretty ordinary stuff.
Well, he had a famous Australian poet to help him.
No, I didn't. I had Les Murray.
Yes, a poet.
No, he does the soccer on SBS.
Mr. Howard, that's another Les Murray.
A clone?
No, they're two different people with the same name. One of them presents the soccer on SBS and the other is a famous Australian poet.
Are there two John Howards?
Christ, I hope not.
As a matter of fact, there are. One of them is an Australian actor who plays a shonky yet quite charming mayor on the ABC series Sea Change.
And what about the other one?
He's Prime Minister.
Right, and which one am I?
Waiting to document. And this is the work crew here that has been very active in preparing the 51L mission at the Operations and Checkout building. The payloads, which include a TDRS satellite, Spartan Halley experiment. And here comes the flight crew now. Commander Dick Scobie, followed by Mission Specialist Judy Resnick, Ron McNair, pilot Mike Smith, followed by Krista McCullough, feature in space, Ellison Onizuka, and payload specialist Greg Jarvis. Big smiles today.
T-minus 15 seconds. T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. We have main engine start. 4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Challenger, roll program.
Roger, roll, Challenger.
Good roll, flight.
Raj, good roll. Engines beginning throttling down now at 94%. Normal throttles for most of the flight, 104%. We'll throttle down to 65% shortly. Engines at 65%, 3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells, 3 good APUs. Velocity 2,257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles, downrange distance 3 nautical miles.
Challenger, go at throttle up. Challenger, go at throttle up. Fido trajectory. Go ahead. Flight GC, we've had negative contact, lost downlink. Okay, all operators, watch your data carefully.
Flight controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction.
There are many reasons to cry conspiracy regarding the Challenger disaster. It is an established fact that senior management at NASA and Morton Thiokol went out of their way to make this tragedy look like an accident, and attempted to sweep under the rug the fact that engineers were worried about the danger cold weather posed on the O-rings. Whether this was an act of murder or severe criminal negligence is on the table for discussion. But would you, in your wildest dreams, ever conceive that there would be a discussion on the Challenger disaster being an act of faking the astronauts' deaths? Believe it or not, in recent years, somebody found pictures of persons with similar names to those of the Challenger crew and jumped to the erroneous conclusion that the astronauts are still alive and that their deaths were staged. This ridiculous claim has been echoed and amplified by flat earthers and space travel deniers all over the internet. The astronauts supposedly still alive are Dick Scobie, Mike Smith, Judith Resnick, Ron McNair, Ellison Onizuka, and Sharon Krista McAuliffe. The only one missing is Gregory Jarvis. I guess these space deniers couldn't find another Gregory Jarvis close enough in appearance to the deceased. The claim that the Challenger crew are still alive is as preposterous as it is profoundly offensive, and it doesn't even withstand primary school levels of scrutiny. It can be debunked with little more than common sense and some quick fact-checking. In fact, some of these claims ultimately boil down to desperation on the part of the deniers. Firstly, 2 of the alleged astronauts who are still alive are in fact brothers of the deceased. All this proves is that siblings have family resemblance. What a shock! Suspicion might be warranted if there were no record of Carl McNamara and Claude Onizuka predating the Challenger disaster, but there is. There are photos of the brothers together long before the tragedy. What? Did NASA somehow get rid of Carl and Claude so that their respective brothers could assume their identities? How desperate do you have to be to try and make a case for a faked death when the only doppelganger convincing enough in appearance is the deceased's own brother? Second, by definition, a doppelganger is supposed to be someone who looks identical or near identical to somebody else. Well, the 2 female doppelgangers have absolutely no physical resemblance to the women who died on Challenger. Why, a blind man could obviously see that they're not the same person. And in the case of Judith Resnick, videos of both women are widely available on YouTube. Not only do they bear no physical resemblance, but also the 2 have distinctly different voices.
No, I really didn't think about it until right about 4 years ago when NASA announced that they were looking for astronauts who would be engineers and scientists on the space shuttle, and it was accidental that I heard about it, and I just took a chance and applied.
Yeah. But once you got into the program, wasn't there a little bit of resentment or a little bit of male chauvinism that was demonstrated to you? There's a very male kind of fighter pilot world that you were entering.
Not at all. As a matter of fact, I think everybody leaned over backwards to make sure that we were treated as equals right from the beginning.
Is there anything in the space program that women inherently do better than men?
Not that I can think of. We're smaller, but that's about the only thing.
But that hasn't changed anything?
No.
You had to change the uniform some, though. You did have a little talk with them about that.
Well, the only thing that they had to do was make a smaller size pressure suit. One size fits all. Small size for men doesn't fit small women, so we now have an extra small.
So I live in New Haven, Connecticut, and therefore, since state courts are the central facet of adjudication in the United States, wanted to start with the 1784 courthouse in New London, Connecticut, that is still operating today as the center of a lively and vibrant set of problem-solving institutions around the country. These courts are interacting with the text in their constitutions. So I've given you from 1818 a little bit of text from the Constitution of the State of Connecticut and a little bit from the state of Alabama in 1819, which of course echoes the Magna Carta. All courts shall be open, and every person for injury due to him in person property remedied by due course of law. You can find these words in many other state constitutions of that era and now.
Resnick the astronaut had a voice with a somewhat thick southern accent. Resnick from Yale has a noticeably higher-pitched voice with no accent. The fact that these deniers would even consider these women to be the same person demonstrates that they are not even trying to make a convincing case. They are interested only in the similar names, but not the actual physical appearance. Why, any lady called Judith Resnick or Sharon McAuliffe will do. Remember what I said about desperation? Seriously, this is Terminator levels of desperation right here. You know, like how the T-800 didn't know which of the 3 Sarah Connors he found in the phone book was his actual target, so instead he just systematically targeted them one by one?
Sarah Connor?
Yes?
Thirdly, the only 2 doppelgangers who do have any resemblance to the deceased astronauts also have significant differences that cannot be explained by 30 years of aging. For example, Richard Scobie, the CEO of Cows and Trees, has distinctly smaller earlobes and a noticeably wider head than Francis Dick Scobie on Challenger. I'm going to refer to him as CEO Scobie for the remainder of the video to differentiate him from astronaut Scobie. In other photos of CEO Scobie, such as his Facebook avatar, the physical resemblance between him and astronaut Scobie are practically non-existent. the physical similarities are nothing more than tricks of the camera. Under the right photographing conditions, any two people could look close enough in appearance. In addition, his Facebook avatar says that he studied at Northern Illinois University. And according to a 2012 Facebook post, 3 years before this false rumor started, CEO Scobie states that he has been married to a woman named Linda for 38 years. And there are pictures of Linda Scobie on his Facebook page. She even has her own Facebook account. If they were married 38 years prior to 2012, that would mean they were married in 1974, and thus still married during the Challenger disaster. Obviously, this doesn't fit with the story that CEO Scobie and astronaut Scobie are the same person. Astronaut Scobie studied at the University of Arizona, not Northern Illinois University, and he was married to a woman named June in 1959. There is obviously no physical resemblance between Linda Scobie and June Scobie. For CEO Scobie and astronaut Scobie to be the same person, he would have to have been married to two different women in two different states at the same time, not to mention father and raise children with these two women and run two completely different careers in two different states at the same time. In addition, according to a search in the white pages, CEO Scobie is in his 60s. His profile on My Life puts his birthday on December 28, 1951, meaning that he just turned 67 years old. This creates an obvious and insurmountable age gap between him and astronaut Scobie. The astronaut was just 4 months short of his 47th birthday when he died on Challenger. If he was alive today, he would be 80 years old in 2019. This means that astronaut Scobie is 12 years older than the CEO. And just look at the guy. Does he look like he's pushing 80 years old to you? Consider also the fact that astronaut Scobie earned his BSc from the University of Arizona in 1965. CEO Scobie would have been 14 years old at the time, and thus still at Niles West High School. Astronaut Scobie graduated from Auburn Senior High School in 1957. CEO Scobie would have been just 6 years old at the time, and is 7 years old when astronaut Scobie married June. Obviously, these two are not the same person. It is obviously just a case of mistaken identity. Likewise, in other photos of Professor Michael Smith, the physical similarities between him and the deceased astronaut are nil. For example, his ears are smaller, his nose and chin are narrower, his eyes and eyebrows are closer together, not to mention the fact that the Professor Smith was born and raised in Madison, Wisconsin, and studied psychology at the University of Wisconsin, earning his BSc, MS, and PhD in 1968, 1970, and 1973 respectively. Astronaut Smith, on the other hand, was born in North Carolina, and earned his BSc in Naval Science at the United States Naval Academy in Maryland. Obviously, if they are the same person, how can he be in two different states studying for two completely different degrees at the same time? These are obviously not the same person. They are two different people with the same name. Hell, the names Michael and Smith are probably the two most common names in the English language. Ironically, the University of Wisconsin-Madison has not one, but 3 members of the teaching staff named Michael Smith. Using the logic of the flat earthers and space travel deniers, since they obviously don't care about physical appearance, then by their same pathetic reasoning, all 4 of these people must be the same person, even though none of them look alike. They just all have the same name, so that's good enough. That's downright idiotic. Clearly, there was no faking of the astronauts' deaths, and these are not the same person. It is all a case of mistaken identity concocted by some idiots or trolls on the internet. These idiotic claims are both disrespectful to the astronauts and their loved ones, and ultimately attempts to draw attention away from the real conspiracy concerning the Challenger. After the Challenger disaster, NASA committed a cover-up. They went out of their way to allege that there was no reason to believe that launching in cold weather would be catastrophic.
The data available to us was the procurement specification for the material that says that it will operate from minus 30 to 500 degrees F. It was the judgment that with the resilience that we saw there, the shrinkage of the O-ring, and under the circumstances of the leak check that is done, that at that temperature the O-ring would perform its function.
They waived Morton Thiyokol's written approval to launch the Challenger and made no attempt to inform the Rogers Commission that Morton Thiyokol's original decision was not to launch.
We did have a meeting with Thiokol. We had a telecom discussion with people in Huntsville, people at the Wasatch Division, and people at KSC. And the discussion centered around the integrity of the O-rings under lowered temperature. We had the project managers from both Marshall and Thiokol in the discussion. We had the chief engineers from both places in the discussion. And Thiokol recommended to proceed in launch. So they did recommend launch. But we had a meeting where there was some concern about the cold temperatures.
When was that meeting?
That was the 27th. It started around 4:45 Central Time.
This whole nonsense about the Challenger crew still being alive really hits me on a very personal level, because I actually knew one of the engineers who tried to save the crew. One of the engineers who tried to stop the launch and spoke out against NASA. His name was Roger Boisjoly. I interviewed Roger Boisjoly before he died.
NASA did their best through a series of many half-truths and some outright lies to make it sound like it was an accident. And that's bullshit, because it was a horrible disaster, but not an accident. When you got people that are your technical experts jumping up and down, raising hell, trying to stop the launch, and being ignored, you can't then, when something goes wrong, turn around and say it was an accident, or it was a bad judgment call, or this or that. Listen, I want to tell you that I was held in such high esteem. At this point in time, I was the technical troubleshooter on the solid rocket boosters concerning the structural cases. I had nothing to do with propellant or the nozzle, but those cases were my baby. And when something went wrong, it was my job to make damn sure that the trouble was ferreted out and fixed. And the decisions that I made carried a great deal of weight, except on the night that we were trying to stop the Challenger launch. By that time, it didn't matter what the hell I said, because they had already made up their minds before the telecon started that they were going to do everything in their power to make us back down so that they could get an approval for launch.
Boisjoly's concern with the O-ring's reaction to cold began in January 1985, when he inspected the boosters recovered from Elson Onizuka's previous flight, STS-51C, the 15th Space Shuttle mission. As an ironic twist of fate, it seems Onizuka had a close brush with death, and his flight aboard Discovery would be a precursor to what killed him.
When I did that inspection on the two boosters of the 15th flight, 2 out of the 6 joints had massive hot gas past the primary seal. And although none escaped to atmosphere, as indicated by a pristine secondary seal which had worked in both instances, we had never seen anything like this before on any flights. The previous 14 flights had a little damage here, a little damage there, but never massive blow-by of a product of combustion from inside the motor. I remembered, after I found this on 2 joints, I remembered on my flight down to the Kennedy Space Center several days before, it had gotten very cold. In fact, I remember clearly the weatherman stating that the temperature had reached 18 degrees Fahrenheit, and that not only the citrus crop was going to be destroyed, but the trees also would have to be replanted, because that was a terribly low temperature for the citrus crop in Florida to withstand. Now Challenger comes along, and basically it's a year later, okay? Essentially a year later. And this time we get a phone call basically asking us if we're concerned about launching in cold weather the next day. The phone caller is stating that the Weather Bureau is predicting a temperature at the time of launch that could be as low as the low 20s and possibly even into the high teens. And so when we found out about this, especially me around noontime, I went crazy, because although the other people saw the photographs nobody but me actually saw the real hardware from the 15th flight. I was the only one that actually saw the near miss that scared the living daylights out of me. And now they're talking about launching at essentially a temperature that is going to be the temperature of the seal, because the heat transfer of the steel through the steel to the O-ring is almost instantaneous. And so if it's 18 degrees outside, the seal temperature is going to be 18 degrees. And this is way below our preliminary testing. And so this was a major dilemma. And there were 4 or 5 of us together, and we decided we're going to get together and we're going to stop the launch. So we met in the Vice President of Engineering's office around lunchtime and waited for him to return from lunch, presented our concerns, and it wasn't difficult for everybody to understand. We now had a unified engineering position with everybody in the chain of command. And then we went with that unified position to the program manager, the actual people that manage the program and decide ultimately what can be done and what can't be done. And we presented the same things to them. Again, they had a whole chain of command right up to the top guy. And again, it didn't take long to convince everybody, that this was a stupid thing to do, to launch in cold weather, because it was virtually guaranteed to have a failure, flight failure, and kill the astronauts. And so a call was then placed late in the afternoon to the Marshall Space Flight Center to tell them of our concerns and to make the attempt to stop the launch. The upper middle manager who received the call, his name was Judson Lovingood, and he pretty much agreed with us that this was a very, very dangerous thing to try to attempt. But he said he didn't have enough authority to stop the launch, but he would relay the information to his superiors. And in so doing, he was positive that they would get back to us in very short order. We waited and waited and waited, and it was over 2 hours went by before we got a call back from the head people who were physically at the Kennedy Space Center for this teacher in space launch because of all the public relations that had taken place. When we got the call back, we were shocked when NASA demanded, they demanded a full-blown flight readiness review, and it was going to take place in 45 minutes from the telephone call. Well, this is the most important technical meeting of our technical lives. There was 4 of us that combined had about 100+ years experience as combined with 4 of us. And we literally ran to our offices, gathered whatever we could to make a presentation to these folks. It was about an hour-long presentation, and it was the most brutal presentation I've ever been in my 27-year career. And the reason I say that is that engineers are always probed, always probed, to make certain, the management makes certain that they are on very firm ground as to what they're saying, what they're presenting, what their recommendations are, and so forth. But this night, we were brutalized, absolutely brutalized by the upper senior level managers at NASA. They did not like the no-launch decision that we were recommending. They were really pissed off, to put it mild. And they just attacked and attacked and attacked. If telephone lines could transmit weapons of war, I could roll up my sleeves or take off my top and show you the scars that were inflicted that night, because it was brutal. And after it was all over, it lasted about an hour, the top guy, Larry Malloy at NASA, asked for Thiokol's launch decision. And our program manager, Joe Kilminster, who was totally convinced that we shouldn't launch before the meeting started, answered in a way that kind of shocked me in a way, because he's sort of a wimp and a very wimpy manager. And NASA had created a lot of pressure up to this point. And so he said that it was the company's recommendation that the launch be canceled and or delayed because of the cold weather. Then Larry Malloy asked his Deputy of Science and Engineering at the Marshall Space Flight Center for his launch recommendation, and George Hardy responded that he was appalled by Thiokol's no-launch recommendation. And let me tell you, people on the outside don't know who George Hardy was, but I have to explain to you that he was in the space program at the Redstone Arsenal, right next to the Marshall facility in Alabama, years before that NASA was officially made an agency. And so he carried a great deal of respect. And when he said he was appalled, I'll tell you, everybody sat straight up in their chairs. My whole inside just about imploded. I was so angry at him for saying that. But yet, even though he said those words, he said, yet he would not overrule the contractor. So that's really the second no vote. First one from Joe Kilminster, recommending not to launch. Then Hardy saying he was appalled, but yet he would not overrule the contractor. That's the second no vote. Now, Malloy goes into a summary mode, and he makes, during his summary mode, comments about our data not hanging together, our data being inconclusive, okay, and then he said, why are you trying to make launch commit criteria on the eve of the launch? When do you expect me to launch? Next April? Those were very pressure-packed statements. Now, let me pause for a second and tell you what takes place normally at these flight readiness reviews. These flight readiness reviews are held specifically for NASA to probe the contractor on whatever thing that they're talking about, to force the contractor to prove that it's safe to launch. Okay, we had already shown them that it was not safe to launch. They didn't like it, they didn't accept it. By Larry Malloy's own admission, he said that the data that we presented was inconclusive. By definition, you cannot launch after a flight readiness review conclusion of the data being inconclusive, because that means you haven't proved that it's safe to launch. And so at the end of this little exchange, which probably lasted another 5-10 minutes, Kilminster asks for a 5-minute offline caucus to reevaluate the data. Now, the managers claimed to the Presidential Commission that they felt no pressure.
You didn't feel that they were trying to get you to change your mind?
I did not feel a significant amount of pressure in that regard.
Well, I'm telling you that's absolute 100% pure bullshit. Because if they felt no pressure, why did they think it was necessary to convene a caucus to reevaluate the data? They felt pressure. Everybody in the room felt pressure. I felt pressure as a major presenter, as an engineer, trying to stop the launch. And I was crushed when they asked for the caucus, and it was granted. Well, the 5-minute caucus turned into about a 30-minute caucus, and we knew right from the get-go that what they were going to discuss and what they were discussing, because there was only one physical body between me and 3 out of the 4 senior executives who were all vice presidents, one of whom was the plant manager who was senior vice president. And it was clear from the discussion that they were trying to list things on a sheet of paper that would justify a launch. Arnie went up shortly after the discussion started, sketched the field joint on a pad of paper, and explained to them about the dangers of launching in freezing weather. They ignored Arnie like he wasn't even there. So he picked up his pad of paper and went back to his position at the table across from me. I was so pissed at the way they treated Arnie that I grabbed 2 8x10 color glossy photographs. One of the massive hot gas past the seal in 1985, and one of a room temperature launch of some much less gas, sort of a grayish and not continuous across the field of the photo at room temperature. It was a 20-second flight. I mean, it was clear that the gas past the seal on flight 22 at room temperature wasn't anything even close to the volume of gas past the seal in the 15th flight at a seal temperature of 53 degrees. I slammed those photos down on the table in front of the three managers, and I was told by one of my colleagues after the meeting was over, I was literally screaming at the managers to simply look at the photos and understand in very simple terms what they were telling us. Namely, the more black you see in the photo, that's the low temperature, guys. And now we're talking about launching in freezing weather, not 53 degrees Fahrenheit, but freezing weather at the time of the launch, and you guys don't think that this is a problem? You gotta be crazy. They ignored me just like they ignored Arnie. It was like I wasn't even talking to them. And they didn't look at the photographs, and they could care less about it, so I picked up the photos and angrily went back to my seat and sat down, and then I kind of put my head in my hands, and I was trying to hold back my anger. I mean, I was really, really, really out of control and getting pissed by the second, because this is not rocket science. This is very easy engineering 101. I can present my presentation to a housewife, and it's perfectly understandable, just using common sense. And now we got guys that have been in this industry for years who understand the technical ramifications of things, and yet we can't get through to these guys.
After Arnie and I had our last say, Mr. Mason said, "We have to make a management decision." He turned to Bob Blunt and asked him to take off his engineering hat and put on his management hat. From this point on, management formulated the points to base their decision on. There was never one comment in favor, as I've said, of launching by any engineer or other non-management person in the room before or after the caucus. I was not even asked to participate in giving any input to the final decision charts.
The long and short of it is, they caucused and had a vote poll amongst only 4 managers and excluded us, the engineers, from the vote. And the reason for that is you have to be unanimous to launch. And they had 4 votes to launch from the 4 vice presidents. They went back on the line, read from a list that they had prepared, and if you look at the list, you'll find that nothing on that page can technically or managerial justify a launch. They went ahead and committed to a launch, knowing full well that they were playing Russian roulette with the lives of the astronauts. Only the type of Russian roulette they were playing was, instead of having a 6-gun with 1 bullet in the 6 chambers, they had a 6-gun that was loaded with 6 bullets, and were praying like hell that when they pulled the trigger, the gun would jam. I mean, that puts it in perspective as far as the statistical probability of failure. When I left the meeting that night, my probability of failure was 100%, even though we had nothing more than the preliminary data and the photographs that we had. That was some of the best engineering information we could have ever presented to make the point to stop a launch for the purposes of flight safety. And so that's how it all unfolded.
Was the command pilot Dick Scobie present during the telecon, or was he ever informed of these warnings from Thiokol?
Who was?
Dick Scobie, the command pilot who was on the shuttle.
No, none of the astronauts were informed. None of the astronauts ever knew that the joints they were flying were faulty. They had kept the astronauts isolated from all this information. After testifying and exposing the truth, I became #1 on the hit list of negative treatment, and they made my life a living hell, to the point that I ended up suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. And I left of my own accord in July of 1986 in order to survive as a human being, because they were continually pushing me down, 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 and making my life a living hell every day. So I had to get out of that environment.
Sounds like you were like punished for your honesty.
I was. And
Yeah.
so was Al McDonald, and so was Ebling, and so was Arnie, and so was Brian Russell. Yeah, we were not treated very well at all by either our former colleagues or people in management. We were considered as whistleblowers, because the media had branded, especially Al and I, as the 2 engineering whistleblowers, and although the media thought they were doing us a favor, that was the kiss of death. Because the minute you're branded a whistleblower in this country, you're blackballed from the industry that you have worked in all your life. And you couldn't get a job even if you offered to work for free. It's that bad.
Having heard what Boisjoly went through to try and save the astronauts, and the maltreatment he received by his bosses as punishment for his honesty, I have to say that anyone who thinks the Challenger crew are still alive are sick in the head and need a bullet in the head.
Yes. Considerably.
Carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction. Reports from the flight dynamics officer indicate that the vehicle apparently exploded and that impact in the water at a point approximately 28.64 degrees north, 80.28 degrees west. We are awaiting verification from as to the location of the recovery forces in the field to see what may be possible at this point.
Last year, I published a video debunking the completely disrespectful claim that the Challenger crew are still alive and even still living under the same names. Since then, the comments of that video have become a dumping ground for flat earth idiots and space travel deniers to smear their idiotic claims and excuses. Most of these comments demonstrate that they are incapable of rational thought or even common sense, to say nothing of the fact that they probably didn't even bother to watch the video. Not to mention these ratings. Look at that. The fact that this perfectly sound rebuttal has more dislikes than likes leaves me with no hope for humanity. But, to hammer the point home, here are some additional pieces of information for anyone out there with rational thought to consider. Firstly, as stated previously, the doppelgangers for Ron McNair and Alison Onizuka are in fact their respective own brothers. Not only are there photos of the brothers together, long predating the Challenger disaster, we have stock footage of the public memorial service that was broadcast on national television. Both brothers are clearly present among the attendees. Furthermore, it's worth noting that McNair and Onizuka are not the only astronauts with siblings. For example, this is Lowell Grissom, brother of astronaut Gus Grissom, who died in the Apollo 1 fire. He looks a lot like his brother too, doesn't he? Using the logic of flat earthers and space travel deniers, This must mean the Apollo 1 fire was a hoax and the Apollo 1 crew are still alive. Obviously that's a wrong assumption, but it is exactly the same ill-considered logic used by Challenger deniers. How about a more recent example? This is Lynn Sultan.
Beautifully done.
That name may not ring any bells, but she is in fact the sister of Laurel Clark, who died in the Columbia disaster. What do you know? She has family resemblance too. Using the logic of the Challenger deniers, the crew of Space Shuttle Columbia must also be alive. Never mind the fact that they have very different voices.
You see the people and who they were as individuals, and while very sad and tragic, the stories of Challenger and Columbia are, I think they're it's an integral part of the overall 30-year history of the shuttles.
I'm not really worried about our mission. I think we're well prepared to take care of the things that are the most likely. If there's something, dreadfully wrong, appendicitis or that kind of a thing, then we can come back to Earth if we need to.
The problem that's happening here is that brothers have not only family resemblance, but also physical differences. Since the deaths of their brothers, 30 years of aging has made that resemblance stand out more than their physical differences. There are several other serious issues with the conspiracy theory. Previously, I pointed out how there is no physical resemblance between the women who died on Challenger and their so-called doppelgangers, that Dick Scobie's doppelganger is 12 years too young to be the astronaut, that Scobie and Smith have significant physical differences that distinguish them from the astronauts, and their family, career, and educational backgrounds are simply incompatible with the astronauts. One of the most embarrassingly stupid attempts to save face that I've heard is the claim that these doppelgangers' educational backgrounds are an elaborate cover story. This is clutching at straws and can be debunked by using common sense. Think about it. If one of their backstories was faked, how could they get a career in the other field? Contrary to what flat earth idiots would have you believe, you don't need to be a Freemason to become an astronaut. The criteria that NASA uses to select astronauts is available for anyone to read on their website. It reads as follows. Today, to be considered for an astronaut position, US citizens must meet the following qualifications: a bachelor's degree in engineering, biological science, physical science, computer science, or mathematics. At least 3 years of related professional experience obtained after degree completion, or at least 1,000 hours pilot in command time on a jet aircraft. The ability to pass a NASA long-duration astronaut physical. Distant and near visual acuity must be correctable to 20/20 for each eye. The use of glasses is acceptable. The first piece of criteria is extremely important. From this alone, we can demonstrate that none of the doppelgangers are astronaut material. Consider, for example, Michael Smith, the astronaut. He satisfied the first set of criteria with his Master's in Aeronautical Engineering in 1968 at the US Navy Postgraduate School in California. That same year, Professor Michael Smith did his BSc in Psychology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. In fact, all of his degrees are in psychology. If they were the same person, and one of their educational backgrounds was a cover story, how could he get a job as both an astronaut and a psychology professor? Degrees in psychology do not satisfy NASA's first set of criteria for becoming an astronaut. Likewise, degrees in naval science and aeronautical engineering do not make you qualified to teach psychology to university students. Would you hire someone who speaks Japanese to teach Italian? Of course not. You'd hire someone who speaks Italian to teach Italian.
Okay, you can sit down. I am sick and tired of being just a language teacher. So instead, I'll be teaching you kids math today.
Math, huh?
We're doing PE. Everyone, get outside.
The fact that one Michael Smith worked as an astronaut and the other currently works as a psychology professor demonstrates that they must have indeed earned their respective degrees. So how can we prove that Professor Smith was indeed a psychology professor at the time of the Challenger disaster? Well, his current profile on the University of Wisconsin-Madison's website only lists his publications dating back to the year 2000. It also lists a lab website link, but it's dead. However, a capture exists on the Wayback Machine, dated January 17, 2006. Interestingly, the publication section shows a photograph of Professor Smith taken from his right side, further exemplifying the physical differences between him and the astronaut. But more importantly, he lists many 20th century articles written or co-written by him. The oldest listed was published in 1971, 15 years before the Challenger disaster. His profile also lists 5 articles from him from 1986. One of them, titled Behavioral Technology for Reducing Occupational Exposure to Styrene, was published in the spring 1986 Journal of Applied Behavioral Analysis. It was co-authored by Professor Michael Smith, and it clearly states that he works for the Department of Industrial Engineering at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. What's that, I hear you cry? If he works for the Department of Industrial Engineering, he must be an engineer, and therefore astronaut material. Not exactly. If you look back to his profile on the university's website, we learn that the Human Factors Research Division was moved from the Department of Psychology and incorporated into the College of Engineering. And as he explains in another 1986 paper, Professor Smith's expertise in industrial engineering lies purely in using robots to study human psychology. Again, that won't get you a career as an astronaut. How about another example? Dr. Judith Resnick satisfied the first set of NASA's criteria with her BSc in electrical engineering in 1970 and a PhD in electrical engineering in 1977 at the University of Maryland. Professor Judith Resnick from Yale, on the other hand, holds not a Bachelor of Science, but a Bachelor of Arts in Law. She is a Doctor of Law, not Science. And again, the years she earned these degrees clash with when astronaut Resnick was earning her PhD. A lawyer is not astronaut material. And if you were being sued, would you hire an electrical engineer to defend you at a trial? And speaking of which, as she is a lawyer, her resume lists several court and Senate hearings where she testified. 5 of them predated the Challenger disaster, the most recent of which is dated June 26, 1985. Her first post-Challenger hearing is dated September 25, 1987. Her resume also lists 2 papers she wrote in 1986, the year of the Challenger disaster. The first paper, Failing Faith, A Judiciary Procedure in Decline, can be found with a quick Google search, and was published in the spring 1986 issue of the University of Chicago Law Review. The paper clearly credits her as a professor of law at the University of Southern California Law Center. There can be no doubt that astronaut Resnick and Professor Resnick are indeed 2 different people. It goes on and on. CEO Scobie has a master's in business administration in marketing and management, hence his careers as CEO of branching and communication agencies. Again, that won't put you behind the controls of a spacecraft, and again, he's way too young to be astronaut Scobie. It should be clear that the claim that the Challenger crew are still alive does not withstand scrutiny and never will. That is because the Challenger crew are all dead. The claim that they are still alive is just a pathetic attempt by a bunch of scientifically illiterate kindergarten dropouts desperate to prop up their flat Earth nonsense and space travel denial.
Earth is flat! It is stationary! Stationary!
I will end this video with these words for any flat earthers and space travel deniers watching who made it this far. Let the fallen astronauts rest in peace. If you can't do that, please go fuck yourselves, and when you're done, go fuck your mother too.
flight dynamics officer indicate that the vehicle apparently exploded and that impact in the water at a point approximately 28.64 degrees north, 80.28 degrees west. We are awaiting verification from as to the location of the recovery forces in the field to see what may be possible at this point.
Two years ago, I released a video debunking the preposterous and disrespectful claim that the Challenger crew is still alive. Last year, I released a follow-up video in which I dug up the research papers that the doppelgangers had published in the years before and during 1986, proving conclusively that they are not the astronauts. I first learned of this fake death nonsense in 2015, when Albino Gallopini sent me an email about it. I told him that the article was obviously false, pointing out that two of them are relatives of the astronauts, and the remainder are obviously two different people with the same name. Gallopini ignored my email and began posting blog articles about the Challenger crew still being alive, along with all kinds of flat earth nonsense and space travel denial. In addition to propagating the same nonsense from other idiotic flat earth websites, Gallopini adds his own to the dogpile. If you recall previously, proponents of this faked death claim excluded Gregory Jarvis from their list. The reason why is obvious. They couldn't find another Gregory Jarvis close enough in appearance to the deceased. But Gallopini has his own lie to account for this omission. It is also possible that Jarvis is truly died in the explosion. Who wants to tell him? As he was really on board as a space shuttle pilot who, instead of reached the orbit, would have landed at a secret base in the desert, probably Area 51 in Nevada, or other facilities located in uninhabited areas. Jarvis was, indeed, a talented military pilot, and on behalf of the Hughes aircraft was embarked on Shuttle Challenger. Where do I even begin with this nonsense? First, Gregory Jarvis was a payload specialist, not a space shuttle pilot. Michael Smith was the pilot on Challenger. Furthermore, in NASA's nomenclature, pilot is more of a first officer or flight engineer. It's actually the commander who does the flying, in this case, Dick Scobie. As a payload specialist, Jarvis didn't even ride in the cockpit. He rode mid-deck. Second, Area 51 is located in Nevada, which is west of Florida. The space shuttle, and for that matter, all Florida-based launches, take off on an eastward trajectory, which always takes them over the water. This is done specifically so that the rocket falls into the sea, and not on a populated area, in the event of an explosion, as was the case on Challenger. If the shuttle was to take off and fly to Area 51, spectators would have noticed it taking off on a more western trajectory. In fact, people from Las Vegas would probably have seen it coming into land. Obviously, that never happened. Ironically enough, the only way for the shuttle to land in Area 51 would have been to first ascend into space, make at least one orbit around the spherical Earth, and then begin the deorbit procedure when Nevada was in range. In any case, people clearly saw the Challenger blow up. By that point, it ceased to be a usable flying machine. How could it possibly have flown to Area 51?
57 feet per second, altitude 4.3 knots.
This is raw, unedited video, just sent via satellite.
Engines throttling up, 3 engines now, 104%. Challenger, go with throttle up. Roger, go throttle.
The picture you were just seeing is Christy McCullough's parents watching in horror. These are the students from her school. Many of them probably had their view blocked just as we did with the television cameras, with just a huge fireball and a huge cloud of smoke. They may not realize yet what has happened. You see concern etched on their faces.
Third, the diagram that Gallipini uses as visual aid is clearly labelled Transatlantic Abort Option. The shuttle had many different abort modes, all of which could only occur after the solid rocket boosters were jettisoned. Challenger never got far enough into the flight to jettison its boosters.
Engines throttling up, 3 engines now at 104%. Challenger, go at throttle up. Roger, go at throttle up.
And in the case of the Transatlantic Abort, or TAL, this was a scenario in which the shuttle had to make an emergency landing across the Atlantic Ocean, in either the UK, or Europe, or Africa. And the window for this abort is between T plus 2 minutes and 30 seconds and T plus 8 minutes and 30 seconds, by which point the shuttle would be well in space. Rather at odds with the hilarious claim by flat earthers such as Gallipini, who claim that space does not exist. Thus, it is impossible for this diagram to prop up Gallipini's delusion of Challenger making a secret landing in Area 51. Much more recently, Gallipini has claimed that Gregory Jarvis is still alive and masquerading as biologist Bruce Lipton. Once again, the same problems arise. First, the two bear little physical resemblance. Second, their respective educational backgrounds clash. Jarvis did his BSc in electrical engineering at State University of New York at Buffalo in 1967, and his master's in electrical engineering at Boston's Northeastern University in 1969. Lipton received his BA in biology at Long Island University in 1966, and a PhD in developmental biology at the University of Virginia in 1971. Keep in mind, it takes at least 3 years to earn these degrees. Third, a quick search pulls up 13 articles written or co-written by Lipton predating the Challenger disaster. The most recent is from 1983. The oldest is from 1972. The Challenger disaster was in 1986. Exactly when was the whole faking the death conspiracy thought up? Before the shuttle program started? Before NASA even existed? Once again, there is no evidence of a faked death. Just a bunch of scientifically illiterate kindergarten dropouts and con men desperate to prop up their flat earth fantasies at the expense of people who lost their lives in the exploration of space. If you want to hear about a conspiracy concerning the Challenger disaster, I suggest reading Roger Boisjoly's online essay or listening to his interview in the first video of this trilogy. Or how about the books written by Al MacDonald or Richard Cook? These are three of the engineers who were directly involved with the Challenger, the men who warned their respective bosses at NASA and Morton Thiokol about the dangers of launching in cold weather, right up until the night before the launch. In these writings, you'll learn how NASA tried to cover up the fact that the engineers were worried, how NASA tried to paint a false narrative that there was no reason to believe an O-ring failure would be catastrophic. Wouldn't that have been enough of a conspiracy to investigate?
I have here a letter which appears to be one signed by you, dated July 31st, 1985. And I gather from the files that we received from you, you wrote a series of letters or memos to, I guess memos is a better way to describe it.
Those were activity reports.
Yes. Expressing your concern about this problem of the seals and the O-rings and so forth. I would ask you, if you don't mind, to read that memorandum dated July 31st, which you wrote to R.K. Lund, who's Vice President of Engineering.
Yes.
Would you mind?
Yes. This letter is written to ensure that management is fully aware of the seriousness of the current O-ring erosion problem in the SRM joints from an engineering standpoint. The mistakenly accepted position on the joint problem was to fly without fear of failure and to run a series of design evaluations which would ultimately lead to a solution or at least a significant reduction of the erosion problem. This position is now drastically changed as a result of the SRM 16A nozzle joint erosion, which eroded a secondary O-ring with the primary O-ring never sealing. If the same scenario should occur in a field joint, parentheses, and it could, then close parentheses, then it is a jump ball as to the success or failure of the joint, because the secondary O-ring cannot respond to the clevis opening rate and may not be capable of pressurization. The result would be a catastrophe of the highest order, loss of human life. An unofficial team, parentheses, a memo defining the team and its purpose was never published, close parentheses, with leader was formed on 19 July 1985 and was tasked with solving the problem for both the short and the long term. This unofficial team is essentially non-existent at this time. In my opinion, the team must be officially given the responsibility and the authority to execute the work that needs to be done on a non-interference basis, parenthesis, full-time assignment until completed, close parenthesis. It is my honest and very real fear that if we do not take immediate action to dedicate a team to solve the problem, with the field joint having the #1 priority, then we stand in jeopardy of losing a flight along with all the launch pad facilities. Then I signed it, and a manager that I work for countersigned it, as concurred.
Thank you. I assume, Mr. Thompson, you agree with the contents of that memorandum?
Absolutely. Yes, sir.
Yeah, was that memo ever handed out to anyone at NASA prior to the shuttle
No,
disaster?
because my boss stamped it company private, which gave it the same force and effect as a government secret document. But what I did do, I made a copy of that memo, and I took secretarial whiteout tape, and I wiped out the company private, and I went around to 4 of my very close colleagues who were like-minded as I was, to let them read it. I didn't give them a copy, I let them read it, so that they knew, these were close colleagues and friends of mine, whose first priority was flight safety, just like me. And I wanted them to know that I had put management on official written notice that if they didn't stop screwing around, they were going to pay a price to be responsible for killing the astronauts. And so that was as far as I could go with it. If I had circulated that, I would have been history in a heartbeat. In a heartbeat. I would not have been able to stick around and try to make a difference because I would have been released. And that release would have actually come from the Center Director at the Marshall Space Flight Center, Dr. Lucas, because he had a far-reaching authority to reach into contractors' organizations and ruin people's careers, not only at NASA, but at the contractors' facilities. See, NASA knew the joints were lousy joints even before I went there in 1980. In 1977, one of their engineers tried to stop a lousy design from going forward, and he lost the battle. He tried for 3 years to stop the design from going forward, and he was denied every single time. So they knew the joint was lousy. They knew that they were taking a gamble of flying a badly designed joint and a fully functioning joint. It was just a matter of time. Well, can you imagine that NASA has a center at the Kennedy Space Center, one at the Johnson Space Center in Texas, and one in the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama, and then headquarters is in Washington, D.C. Well, can you imagine that the trouble with the Huntsville division or the center keeping a bad joint under covers and under wraps and secret from the ultimate decision makers in Washington, D.C. And if the people down there ever found out about the lousy design and the compromising stuff that had taken place, there would have been heads rolling. But the Center Director at the Marshall Flight Center, he ran that like a Gestapo prison camp. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that. He had his people under him scared to death because he could crush their career in a heartbeat. And he had basically stated that the Marshall Space Flight Center would never, ever be responsible for delaying a launch. Now that's sick. A guy like that should have been taken out and shot right on the spot.
Can I quote you on that?
Sure you can.
Cool.
So, you know, NASA has a history of being less than truthful about their screw-ups. Just like they did on Apollo. They said the astronauts at Apollo, on the Apollo fire, died instantly, which is, in fact, absolutely not true. they died an excruciating, painful death as they were inhaling flaming oxygen.
Hey, how are we going to get to the moon if we can't talk between three buildings? I can't hear a thing you're saying. Jesus Christ. Again? But how are we going to get to the moon if we can't talk between two or three buildings?
That's how they operated. That's how they still operate. Columbia happened for the same reason the Challenger happened. Because you had two managers that were hell-bent to say that everything was okay and just come home. And they burned up and killed the astronauts once again. All because they canceled a $200,000 check of the vehicle from space and or from the ground. And one of the top managers, I think her name was Mia Hamm, canceled that request. Listen, we got such good optics that we can do stuff from space and from the ground that people would be horrified. I mean, they can tell you if you have hamburgers or hot dogs on a grill, from space. Mm-hmm. So they have the resolution capability to actually spot any damage that was there, but the decision was made by the program managers not to do it because everything was okay. How could 2 pounds of density foam cause any damage to the leading wing? Well, during that investigation, they found out that a piece of 2-pound density foam propelled at Mach 0.8 blew a hole in the leading edge of the wing that was approximately a foot in diameter. Mm-hmm. And so, once again, all the hype about flight safety was just a mirage. And 7 more astronauts paid with their lives for that mirage. I was furious when people would refer to it as an accident because it wasn't an accident. Horrible disaster, yes, but not an accident. An accident is something that just occurs out of the blue. But when you have something that is known ahead of time to have a high potential of being a disaster, you sure as hell can't call it an accident just because stupid people went ahead and made a stupid decision. Mm-hmm. I would have really liked to have seen the 4 backhaul managers and the upper echelon managers at the Marshall Space Flight Center be charged with either voluntary or involuntary manslaughter. I would have really loved to have seen that happen, and the reason being is not because I wanted to get back at them, and please understand that that was not the motive and would never be the motive, but I wanted to get the attention of people in these positions that they cannot just cavalier make decisions based on their profit line, their profit motive, and disregard the number one priority in these programs, which was flight safety, without paying a price. So that's my personal feeling. I think that they made a mistake by not putting some of the people away during Apollo days, and they repeated that same mistake with Challenger and also Columbia.